If I was blind, tell me how would you finish this line?
Das Truth, Part 10. Candles. Cameron looked up at a bright, star-filled sky and breathed in the cool night's air. Before the fall, seeing a massive amount of glittering stars like jewels in the sky was uncommon. Between the bright lights of the city and the street lights of the small towns, the light pollution was the norm in most developed places. The sky overpowered by modernization. But now, with the smaller global populations, the use of clean energy became the new standard, mandating less pollution at all levels of human life. The night skies were clearer, and the mornings bluer than it had ever been before the modern era. He breathed in deeply, closed his eyes for a moment to quiet his mind. The silence was broken by soft, happy, childlike giggles. He opened his eyes and smiled as he watched Sadie barrel around the corner wearing red and white teddy bear printed pajamas, some footies, and a fuzzy brown housecoat, gripping a glass jar in one hand. Sadie, you won't catch fireflies that way, honey. You have to slow down to catch them, he encouraged. She smiled at him and immediately slowed her pace. Like this? She said as she slowly maneuvered the glass jar over the slow blinking lights of a nearby firefly. She leapt for joy when she managed to scoop in 3 more and quickly closed the lid. Cam, look, I got some, she said as she ran up to him. She proudly placed her jar on the table next to Cam, and then slowly slid her chair next to his. You ready? He said. She nodded and leaned her head against his arm. He pulled out a book. I'm going to read a book tonight that was very popular when I was younger. It's called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I think you'll like it, he said as she pulled her blanket up to her chin. The candlelight gave light as he read through the night. Thrive. 1:30 p.m. Highway 6, Utah, somewhere near Soldier Creek. A convoy of military vehicles drove down the scenic Utah highway. The brown, orange, and green colors dotting the land made it all seem surreal against the buttes in the far background. The UGN had managed to regain control of most areas of the country within a year of the Great Fall, but there were still small pockets of remote areas where they had yet to scour and cleanse. The current order of business was to sweep through these rural areas, going from place to place as they did in the larger population cities, and clear out any cannibal nests and restore order and government. Their goal was to bring in all survivors to one of their 15-minute cities to be integrated into the new order. For Deacon Mowry, 46, slim build, clad in a full-on white hazmat suit in 110-degree Utah temperature had become his new routine. His bio unit had been part of the convoy to test survivors and administer the required vaccine. He was also part of the UGN research team, formerly the CDC, to monitor any new developments, behaviors, or diseases. Most of his time had been spent in laboratories, so little field trips like these gave him a change of pace. The Hummers did not have much in the way of air conditioning, so he rode with the windows down and stared out into the road ahead as they drove. His escort had driven about an hour down the road when they saw a person standing in the middle of the road in the distance. The convoy slowed as they made their approach and stopped 200 feet from the person. The individual looked like a thin, malnourished, blonde-haired woman. Their hair was kind of stringy, and they stood there with their head down. Her body randomly twitched and stood partially facing them. The soldiers climbed out of their vehicles with their weapons drawn. This is the UGN Military Special Unit and Enforcement Team. Keep your hands where we can see them, and we will approach. Your cooperation is important, one of the soldiers yelled through his biohazard mask. Deacon looked up from the back seat to see what the soldiers were yelling at. He opened his door and slid out. He slowly walked around the vehicle and approached the soldiers with caution. What's going on? He questioned as his eyes fell on the thin person standing in the road. Please, sir, keep back until we are sure it is safe, commanded another soldier, raising his hand up for him to stop in his tracks. It could be a survivor, he pointed out to them. One of the soldiers nodded and approached the person slowly. Ma'am, we're here to help, he said as he inched a bit closer, but still kept enough distance to react. The woman jerked a bit, and then slowly raised her head. Then she shuffled to face them. Her face was gaunt, and her attention seemed out of focus. All of their hearts began to pound a little faster. Something inside them alerted their senses, and a sense of dread fell upon all of them. Sir, she doesn't look good. She might be one of the infected, another soldier yelled out. Yeah, but if she's infected, she would have killed herself by now. Look how diminished she looks, another pointed out while still training his gun on her. Yeah, but they usually start bleeding from the nose, right? She isn't. And why is she staring at us like that? Another question. Maybe she's delirious? I mean, it's been a year. How on earth is anyone surviving out here? Another groan. I guess you're conveniently forgetting humans are super resilient. And what about the cannibal nest we've been clearing out for the past year? Where there's a will, there's a way. Another chimed. Hey, Doc, what do you think? Asked the nervous team leader. Deacon moved closer and looked at her from where he was. Ma'am, do you understand us? Are you feeling okay? He said as he trained his eyes on her intently. He observed the black rings around her eyes and the sunken features of her face. Her lips appeared dry, and he observed the jerky motion of her stance. She straightened her gaze on him, and for a moment they locked eyes even from that distance. Then all of a sudden, she ran toward them in a full-on sprint. Stop! Yelled one of the soldiers. Don't kill her! Deacon yelled as he watched the scene unfold in slow motion. I said stop! Another yelled before discharging his weapon and firing at her legs. She toppled over and slipped just a few feet from them, thrashing and making all manner of high-squealed noises and grunts. Stop, stop, stop! Don't kill her! Deacon said as he pushed past the soldiers. He stopped at the same distance as them and watched her squeal out in pain from the ground. Okay, Doc, we didn't kill her. What do you want to do now? The team leader said as they all looked down on her. Bag and tag her. I want to know what's wrong with her and where she came from, he said as he watched her movements closely. Her eyes were trained on them. Unlike the sickness that often left the infected confused and off focus, she seemed more hyper-focused on them now, even in her injury. She spoke incoherent words and grunted and moaned. It made the hairs stand on his arms through his suit, but he felt like they'd stumbled across something important. For now, we'll divert to Dugway, he said, as he watched the soldiers shoot several tranquilizers into her before restraining her to a mobile gurney. They lifted her up and carried her into a hazmat containment truck further back in the convoy. They quickly turned their convoy around and headed east into the hot Utah sun. Gwen. Her eyes fluttered as she relived the nightmare that had become her life. Her heart broke even in her sleep, and not a day passed by that she didn't need the help of some sleep aid to get a decent night's rest. Tears rolled down her face involuntarily as she tossed and turned. She couldn't escape her mind wanting to revisit the memories of the past over and over again. Every day, she had to get up and pretend like everything was okay because showing distress was highly frowned upon in this new society. She was guilty of laughing at the term thought police in the past before the fall. The term had gone down in every conspiracy theorist's playbook and had become a joke to the disbelieving. Now conspiracy was reality, and she, more than most, knew what was behind that pale curtain of illusion. Papers about the current New Haven program littered her bed, as well as other documents researching the New World Order. Eugene had come out of nowhere as a savior of the world right after the fall, which she found rather suspicious. Since the UGN took over, the murmurings about the terrorist group Ares had suddenly stopped. It had been a weird year, but she knew most terrorist groups don't just fall off the face of the planet all of a sudden, even in the face of a horrific pandemic. She also doubted all of them died in the year of the fall and Reconstruction. She had never given up on her story, but she kept it safely hidden to herself. She said nothing. Their world was different now, and she was not permitted to release anything negative. Now her research was for her own mind. Everything was wrong. Something was very off, and her journalistic mind never stopped gnawing on that bone. They were watched and monitored in every aspect of their lives. Her beloved America was no more. First Amendment gone. It was all UGN now. She missed traveling. All the travel had been suspended until all areas within every territory had been thoroughly scoured and cleansed. They said it was to ensure no resurgence of the Lackman's disease. The mere mention of that illness was enough to keep the general public in mass compliance and staying put in the new 15-minute cities that had been built. No one argued with their logic because no one wanted to be a victim of it, nor relive their interactions with people who had it. Her phone's alarm woke her from her sleep. Her eyes shot wide open, and she looked up at the ceiling defeated. She wanted to stay in bed, but today was not her day off. One more day, she murmured as she started the day the same as before. She wiped the steam from the mirror and stared at the bags underneath her eyes. She breathed out deeply, opened her medicine cabinet, grabbed her pill bottle, and popped the pill into her mouth. I just want to disappear, she thought. She heard a slight tap at the bathroom door. Hey, Angela, I want to grab some breakfast before we go in, Shalise said from the other side. Yeah, I could use some coffee too, she answered back as she slowly opened the door. Need this? She said as she held up a bottle of the anti-anxiety pills she had taken. Shalise stood there in a fuzzy purple housecoat. Her hair appeared tangled and disheveled. Shalise wanly smiled. Sure, she said as she accepted the bottle on her way into the bathroom. She had just as many dark circles under her eyes as she had. A little later, Angela found herself staring off into space during their routine morning meeting at the newly revamped Sunbury Times news network. The owners of the Daily Giant died during the fall, so she was repurposed. Their 15-minute city was called Sunbury Province, and their news organizations and columns were named after the city's designated government sector that the column or news station belonged to. This ensured control of all information circulating in that city, or so they thought. So I guess you're going to cover the Declan story? His execution is tomorrow, said a smiling, sandy-haired, bearded, portly man in a light-colored pinstripe shirt and neatly pressed tan khaki. His press ID badge swung about his chubby neck. Huh? Oh yeah, she said, breaking her mind from the nothing her mind had retreated to. She looked around the room and saw all the others walking out of the meeting. Declan had been one of the 6 people the UGN said were found to be conspirators of the horrific cyber attack that allowed all the financial systems and the records information banks to go down a year ago. He had been sentenced to death for treason 6 months ago after a statewide manhunt brought him down. They found him and the 5 others hiding in a well-stocked cave in Arizona. His execution date was tomorrow, for which she had been assigned to write an online column about. She had been scheduled to interview him inside the UGN federal prison camp today at 2 p.m. Declan had maintained that he was innocent. She was tasked with interviewing him one last time before his execution. She stood up, stretched, and gathered her notebook and laptop from the table. I gotta prepare my questions, Eugene. We'll catch up later, she said as she left the room. She soon entered her cushy office with a wide wraparound window that gave her a breathtaking view of the city. She opened her computer and began researching what Declan's job was before the fall. He had been a top-level cybersecurity contractor whose sole job was to create programs to prevent such attacks on the government. He had no prior run-ins with the law, and he had been a staunch independent voter. He had an impressive military service record. Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it, he had been deployed there after the 9/11 attack. Many of his past social media posts often criticized the government at that time for not doing enough to protect our services and infrastructure. He often said this was why he created his private cybersecurity company, Far East Dynamics, to help fill in the holes. He was the model citizen on paper. His family and friends that managed to survive the fall were all in disbelief when his image was spread across every news station in the country for suspicion of espionage and conspiracy. When they brought him in, he maintained his innocence and accused the government of trying to cover up the crimes he knew they had done. He managed to elude capture for 6 months, and when they found him, he had been holed up in a secluded cave in Arizona, his home state. The 5 other people with him had been his wife, 2 children, a close friend and colleague, and his colleague's fiancée. They had electricity, water, and everything they needed to survive for several years. The UGN provided details that the way they caught him was by accident. Someone amongst them had used the shortwave radio to communicate for a brief moment. At the same time, a routine skim of the area by a military drone passed by and intercepted it. The UGN triangulated where the transmission could have possibly come from and sent sniffing drones in the area to search for short radio wave transmissions. Had it not been for that chance interception, he would have stayed on the run. You are all being lied to. They did this, not us. Wake up before it's too late. It's only going to get worse, he said as the UGN agent stuffed him in the back of a black SUV with dark windows. The press agent screamed for him to explain just before the door closed, and they sped away. Angela watched the video of his capture. She looked at the expression on his face the day they stuffed him in the car. The hairs on her arms stood on its end as she paused the video at the shot of his face just before they closed the door. It was the same expression the man had that told her about the New Haven camp. She believed him, but she had to conduct the interview as if she took no sides and was solely there to report the news. She knew when she wrote the column it had to sound objective with no hint of propagating any conspiracy. She began to write in her notebook, mapping out her interview. She looked at the digital clock in her office. It was 12 o'clock. She had an hour to prepare. Sadie. Cameron waved to Sadie as the big yellow bus pulled away to take her to the UGN primary magnet school. Once the bus was out of sight, the smile on his face disappeared. He walked over to his blue and white UGN BioNTech smart delivery truck to start his day. As soon as he hopped into his vehicle, it greeted him and asked him to place his hand on the ID verifier to activate the vehicle. He had firmly assumed his identity, and no one was the wiser as to who he really was. His old life had been evaporated, and now he was a rations delivery man. The rations were a guaranteed food delivery service for every registered citizen in the country. Each sector had drivers that delivered basic essentials. Citizens could still go to the grocery stores and other venues to buy additional goods and services like before, but everyone was given a basic living ration for free as part of the new way of doing things, just like every citizen was given a monthly cadets stipend. Working allowed you to attain more credits, but the monthly stipend was enough to cover your essential needs. He didn't mind his job because it did not require him to interact with anyone. All he had to do was do his deliveries. The UGN figured he'd be perfect for the job since his assumed identity had a large background in trucking and transporting goods. They ensured he'd be home every night, and at most, the distance he traveled would be as far as a sector or state over and back. He often made deliveries in what was formerly known as Washington, D.C., which was now the home of the North American UGN Triad Global Embassy. The state had been renamed Palatine after UGN think tank Master Andre Palat. He was the first Eugene general that took back an entire state in the Battle of Reclamation. Cameron had been making deliveries there for a few months now. The city had drastically changed. No fossil fuel vehicles were allowed to operate anywhere in that sector. Everything was integrated, electric, and verifiable. Vehicles did not start unless the vehicle belonged to you, and they were tracked. Solar and other forms of clean energy were used to run the city. Windows and everything were fully automated and AI powered, so that when walking the street, window advertisements pitched personally to you and your social or economic habits. Facial recognition technology was everywhere, so Cameron kept his beard just in case old files turned up somewhere. New monuments had been erected to remember the tragedy of the fall and the triumph of the new society over the old ideals they felt had caused it to happen. He drove through the city observing how life went back to normal, but not. The citizens gracefully walked the streets with vacation badges swinging about their necks as required by law. Cameron parked his vehicle in the parking deck of an apartment complex only a few hundred feet from the embassy area. He parked at the very top of the deck and looked out over the city for a moment. He got out and opened the back door of his van to get the rations with the automated crate. He waited for the automated dolly to unfold itself from the van carrying his delivery for this building. As he walked, the crate rolled behind him, following his lead. He pressed for the elevator, entered, and waited for his dolly to enter in as well. He worked his way down from the top floor of the complex to the bottom. The tenants gladly opened their door at his knock. He scanned their smart ID bracelets and had them sign for delivery receipt on his handheld tablet. After about an hour, he made his way back up to the top floor that led back to the uppermost parking deck and opened the back door to his van. "Dolly, pack up," he commanded. The automated dolly moved up to the van and packed itself back in. He closed the door back and checked his watch. 1 o'clock. Time to eat some lunch, he said as he reached into the front seat and grabbed his lunch bag. He stepped back out the van, sat on the railing of the parking deck as he enjoyed the view of the city with its fountains, green trees, crisp, clean walkways, and glistening metal sculptures. He pulled out a few items and began to eat. He even pulled out a small pair of binoculars and looked down at the embassy area. He watched some others sit down on the embassy steps to enjoy lunch as he was. Then Cameron watched a pair of big black government SUVs pull up in front of one of the buildings. He laid his sandwich down and watched closer. Agents in black suits with white earpieces jumped out and opened the door. He'd figured it was probably another UGN lawmaker returning from their usual lunch routine. He still observed. A woman with silver hair, dressed in a sleek gray power suit with red lipstick, turned to speak to another person climbing out. Cameron focused on her and the man. Cam's chest instantly pounded. He knew them. Cam said, licking his lips as his heart pounded all the more. He watched the man turn to direct the other agents. Cam zeroed in on his face. "Charlie?" he questioned. In an instant, his anger kindled. His mind quickly put two and two together. If Charlie was with that woman, then that meant that the woman he was seeing was Mother. Cam let his hands fall to his side in tight balls. "They are all alive. Why am I surprised? They did this. They tried to frame me. They released that virus. They brought the whole world down. Why are they out in the open here? Was this the plan all along?" He ranted as he began to pace back and forth for a moment. He watched them ascend the stairs of the UNAT intelligence building as if it was just a normal day for them. They were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were hiding in plain sight. He and Charlie had been given the vaccine, and if he was given it, that meant the whole Oprah organization had taken it so that they could assume power when the ashes of their treachery cleared. They were now in control. But Cameron in that moment was intent on bringing Mother and Charlie down permanently. The operation was global. They reached further than anyone could fathom. He knew he could never kill Aubrey off. He wasn't even going to try. No. This was about vengeance for Hector, Sarah, Nurse Sanchez, Dr. Serrano, for their betrayal of the American people. He stood there overlooking the city. I'll watch them a little bit longer and let them get comfortable. But I gotta make a plan because I have Sadie now, Cam thought to himself. Cody. 1:30 p.m., Pallet Town, UGN Special Forces Coordinator Office. The tic-tac sounds of sleek red stilettos hitting the marble floors echoed the halls of the newly reconstructed UGN Special Intelligence Building. Margaret Thatcher straightened her gray jacket as she fumbled through papers as she went. Charlie walked close behind her. Have we found her yet? Margaret said as she handed Charlie back the manila folder. No. We're still attempting to locate her. It was impossible to do that before the fall, and I doubt we'll be able to do it now, unless she makes a serious mistake. She could be dead. We never did give her the vaccine, he answered as they turned the corner into her office. Charlie pulled the door close behind them. She spun around, a bit flustered and irritated. She's the only one who knows everything. She could easily expose us all. I need this loose end capped and sealed, Charlie, she demanded. Like I said, we'll never find her unless she makes a mistake. I've got a feeling she's not the type to. She's been silent since it all went down. I think we should stop trying to find her before she does what we don't want. If she wants to stay gone, let her. I feel like we're playing with fire, he reasoned. Then he rubbed his forehead. You chose her for that job, for that reason. Remember? He said. Then Margaret conceded and sat down behind her desk, a bit defeated. What if someone finds her? If she gets compromised, would she talk? She contemplated. We control everything now. Who's she going to talk to? We own the satellites and all the communications go through us, he said as he sat down opposite the desk. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I chose her because she's very talented in circumventing all of that. She still has the power to bring down everything again. The computer virus is hers. She made it, and only she can remove it or control it or even identify it. My people have been looking for its signature and are unable to trace it. No one knows how she did it, she said. Charlie thought for a moment, uncrossed his legs, and stood up. Okay, but I think you're playing a dangerous game with a dangerous hacker. She knows who you are and what we all look like. It's best to leave her alone and keep her happy. Sometimes absolute control is not always needed, Margaret, he warned as he walked out. She rolled her eyes and swiveled her chair around to contemplate what Charlie said. Little did she know that she was already compromised and had been for a long time. 1:45, Pritchett Park, formerly the site of Foxborough State Hospital, Boston, Massachusetts. Oh, Margaret, if only you'd listened to Charlie. Arya smirked as she leaned back in her chair, observing the creases on Margaret's face through the camera on her computer. She plucked a few more commands in and then removed her headset. I have to continue to be careful because little Margaret doesn't like not having control of everything. I told her I'd burn her if she tried this, she said as she stood up and stretched. When the new government made plans to revamp Boston after the devastation of the entire planet, Arya slipped into the reconstruction planning system and placed an order to turn the dilapidated ruins of the state hospital into a nice park with beautiful gardens, fountains, art for sculptures to help hide her reinforced bunker deep beneath the ground. They had no clue that they were used to conceal her location. She ensured the project had no need to dig into the ground in the area of the concealed entrance. She slipped the plans and gave it government approval. No one even knew that the plans were planted and the authorization was falsified. She continued to monitor the state of the world from her little haven. She had heard the horror stories coming in from all over the world. A sickness had spread, causing people to kill themselves. Arya had hacked all of Oprah's files and learned that the treason had snaked its way all the way to the highest levels of every government in every country. She had thought the operation was just about resetting the system, not killing millions of people like that. Oprah had developed a viral compound that seemed to turn off the self-preservation switch in people's brains. She had also found their formula for the vaccine. She had used their own system to have a few tubes of it delivered to an undisclosed location without them knowing or seeing it. She wiped out every record of the delivery. With everything in chaos, no one even noticed. She also cleverly switched over all of her currency over to the credits without so much as raising an eyebrow. She made a straw woman that didn't exist except on paper who owned a small apartment on the outskirts of Boston. She paid taxes, had a badge ID, and had a small inconspicuous job as a digital librarian. She digitally created a realistic avatar and had her weekly UGN rations delivered there to that shell location. She was the Invisible Man, that hat guy in the painting whose face no one ever saw. She took over the cameras in the area when she needed to go out to get supplies or step out of her bunker to get some air. She'd completely created blind spots where the facial and gait recognition technology existed. She looped the images or eradicated her images whenever it existed. Margaret looking for her had been laughable, but she wasn't going to underestimate Margaret's burning need for self-preservation. She had to be careful. She knew Oprah was still alive and well and had full control, like they had always wanted. Censure. 2 p.m. Eugene Reclamation Prison, Pallet Town. Angela fidgeted with her notebook as she sat behind a metal desk in a room with bars on the window and a few special forces soldiers posted at every corner in the large room. Declan had one request for his last request, and that was to grant an interview with one news outlet of his choice. Why he chose Sunbury Times News Network was anyone's guess, but they were happy to be chosen. He had specifically requested that Angela be the one to interview him. It was a story everyone wanted except her when it was assigned. She had been the envy of the office because he was a big story for them. Angela waited as she heard the footsteps of many approaching the door that led into the area. A soldier entered the room clad in all black gear. Declan, dressed in a white prison jumpsuit, entered the room. His eyes and Angela's eyes locked. He'd been chained from wrists to ankles. He had a medium build, brown eyes, low-cut hair, and clean-shaven face. He maneuvered himself behind the desk opposite her. His eyes never left hers, and they looked at each other for a small stretch of time. Angela broke the silence when she cleared her throat and searched her notebook for her first question. Before she could ask it, he spoke. "It's okay, Angela. I have trouble sleeping too," he said. His voice was deeper than she expected. She quickly looked up at him. "Huh?" she said, almost forgetting her focus. "The past year was crazy, so it's okay," he said quietly, but his gaze never left her. "You could have chosen anyone to record your first, only, and last interview, but you chose Sunbury Times News Network to do it. Why?" she asked. She was curious. He smirked. "I didn't choose them. I chose you. You just so happen to be alive and working for them," he said, as a matter of fact. Her eyes set on him again. "Me? Why? Why me?" she questioned. He scratched at his non-existent beard. He then turned to one of the guards. "Can I get a pack of smokes? This is going to take some time." The guard nodded, walked up to him, and handed him a fresh pack of unopened cigarettes and a white lighter. Angela's eyes widened with surprise as they handed it to him. "You want something? Water? Something to eat?" Declan nonchalantly asked. Angela nodded. She had forgotten to eat, and the way he said it would take some time to answer her question, it seemed smart to get some water. "I could use some water," she said. One of the guards nodded, left out the room, and returned shortly later. They laid drinks, snacks, and food on the table. He took a pull of his cigarette and blew it out as if savoring the act. "I remember a time when reporters reported the truth. When I lived in D.C., I used to follow the Daily Giant religiously, because y'all spared no one. I liked that. Y'all did real reporting, and it was nonpartisan and unbiased. he said, taking another pull of his cigarette. Angela smiled, remembering that time and what it felt like to report real news. Moreover, some of the best reporting and questions often came from you at Draven's press briefings. They hated when you grabbed the mic. You had a knack for holding a camera to their feet, he said, giggling slightly to himself. Angela laughed too. She hadn't laughed in a long time. Never seen someone run from a room so quick. Then when you stepped to the mic to ask questions, you were unafraid. And your boss was to be admired because he was absolutely unafraid to sick his bulldog on them. I respected the hell out of that, he said, setting his eyes admirably on her. I didn't want to tell my story to anyone that would sugarcoat it. I needed someone like you to hear this, he said as the smile faded from his face and his dark eyes still on hers. They say you helped orchestrate the cyber attack that brought down the country's defense to allow the total wiping of all wealth and records. They say you're an heiress operative, one of many. She said, finally kicking off why she was there. Her eyes stilled on him and observed his face and body language. He smiled. There you go. There you are. Good. I knew you still had it in you, he said proudly. Angela couldn't lie. It felt good to just go in on him like that, cutting to the chase. She felt like her old self. I'm not any of those things. I'm a victim like everyone else. I was tasked to stop this from happening. I am a vet, and I built a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity company with government contracts that would go strong for the next 25 years. There was no reason for me to destroy my own business, he said, as he took another pull. So what do you think happened? You asked me to be here. You must know that my background is investigative journalism, she said as she grabbed for her water bottle. He nodded. I know. I'm counting on you. Listen, whoever is behind this, they are powerful and are everywhere. They have control of everything and everyone. This was orchestrated, he said as he leaned in. One night, when I was running my usual secure sweep, I came across a strange line of code. My team and I quietly monitored what it was doing. We even put traps throughout the network to alert us when it activated and deactivated as we were attempting to track the originator's location. It was so subtle, almost imperceptible. No one would even notice it there. It wormed its way through every system we had without setting off a single alarm. Even the hardened remote areas were infected with it. Hardened remote areas took people within it to be a part of this hack. I was supposed to have a meeting the next day for my daily security brief at the White House, but I never made it. The new program I designed was able to keep up with the hackers' movements. It was major because this thing was in everyone's system from Russia to China. Everyone was infected. The security clearance gave me access to a lot of leeway because we often coordinated our security with multiple global partners and international security teams. This hacker had a unique signature, and it was coming from a place right here in the U.S., somewhere near Boston. It was made to move like Gwen, he said. Angela shook her head. I'm sorry, Gwen? She asked for clarity. Declan smiled. Gwen. Gwen is the name of a cloak of invisibility from an old story called The Dream of Ronsby, which grants the person sitting on it invisibility. That's what the signature did. It granted the user invisibility and complete access to do as they will to any system in the world. Quite a dangerous hack when you're talking about nuclear codes and priority systems, he said as he looked at Angela. This person has ultimate control, he stressed. Angela shook her head. Don't you mean group? It can't be possible any one person could have done that, right? She questioned. Not true. Some of the best hackers in the world are solo. They are usually very young, so oftentimes when they are found, they are instantly recruited. Better to have them on your side than against you, you know, he said as he reached for one of the turkey sandwiches. She wrote quickly in her book. So, how did you get caught up in this? She asked the obvious. He shook his head and rubbed the back of his neck. That morning, my team and I decided to record the behavior of the line of code. As soon as we did that, the signature moved quickly toward us. We tried to close the back room, but it was so fast and it prevented us from shutting down the connection. A message popped up on every screen we had. It said, why are you in my system, Declan? Play with fire, get burned. Within 60 seconds of that message appearing, Our servers began to run at full speed. It was ripping all of the information from our servers and at the same time wiping everything as it went. Then it began overheating the machine. Before we knew it, they started exploding. It was like bombs going off. We barely got out of there, he said as he recounted the incident. Our building was on fire. The halogen fire system should have engaged, but it didn't. I knew then that whoever had hacked my system had made sure it all burned down. So instead of being at the briefing, I was watching my building burn to the ground. 30 minutes later, we watched small rocket devices shoot into the sky all over the city, and you know the rest, he said as if reliving that day. Angela nodded. So how does all this play into you being hunted down for treason? She asked. Everyone was going crazy, so I figured it was best to get far away from the city. I took my wife and children and booked it. My other colleague who saw what happened to the building asked if he and his fiance could come because their apartment was in the city and it wasn't safe. I had a cabin out in the mountains, so we headed there first. I also had a closed network system out there, he said, grabbing another cigarette. She grabbed the sandwich and ate it as he continued. I figured I could find some answers as to what was going on. Networks were down, but not satellites, so I hacked into Starlink and used their network to find out what was going on. I was hearing horror stories from the radio about people killing themselves all over the world and on the dark web about cannibalism and other things. Then I came across some chatter in a secret back room. I snuck in undetected, or so I thought. They were talking about Ares. They said everyone believed there was an Ares terrorist group and that everything was going down as planned. I really couldn't believe the conversations they were having. These people were issuing orders about next phases and all kinds of stuff. At first, I thought maybe someone was joking, so I just observed and waited to see if something they planned happened. It did the next day, as they said. That's when I realized I had accidentally stumbled across their dark room, the ones behind it all. They were discussing vaccines, even the name of the governor they wanted to erect, UGN, and who some of the players would be to lead it. I listened in on them without so much as throwing a speck of dust. They seemed very upset with finding some girl named Arya, he said. Angel's eyebrows furrowed. Who's Arya? She asked. She's the hacker. They got to bring the whole system down. And I think that was the hacker I had encountered at the office that day. They are afraid of her, even though they originally employed her. I can imagine they are still looking for her. If she's smart, she'll stay hidden, he said, leaning closer to Angela again. Angela, it goes high. Nothing is what it seems. I'm being executed because of what I stumbled across, he said, locking eyes with her. They don't want anyone to know. If you pursue this story, it can only be for yourself, your own knowledge. They won't play fair. It goes deep. I made a mistake of continuing to listen in on that room. If I had had any sense, I would have left that room and severed all connections. The night they realized I was in the room, one of them spoke to me directly. He said, lowering his head for a moment. Then he raised his head, his eyes full of sorrow. The person in the room said, hello? How long have you been quietly listening in on our little conversation? Never you mind. This is one room you'll regret entering. So you have two choices. Join us because you seem quite talented enough to be here, or we destroy you for entering a place you were not invited. Make your choice. You don't have long. I was very freaked out by that. So I pulled all the cords from my computer. I immediately ran down the stairs from my room and yelled at everyone to pack. They were all very confused, but did as I said. We were out of there within 20 minutes. We drove the road with no lights on, and within a few minutes of us getting down the road, I heard a loud explosion. When I looked back in my rearview mirror, I saw a fireball where my cabin in the mountains used to be. You could check for yourself if you're brave enough. That's when I knew we had to run, he said, visibly shaken. Angela's eyes widened. What hit your house? She urged. He shook his head, his eyes downcast. It was so quiet wherever it was. Maybe a drone. I knew this was a dangerous thing happening. By the next day, we heard news about a manhunt, and I was the target. So I reached out to someone I used to know for help. People called him a conspiracy theorist, but he was the only one I knew who'd believe me. Like I said, I'm like y'all, just innocent, and I'll maintain that. Angela, be careful if you pursue this, he said as he sat back and watched her. Angela jotted a few things in her notebook. Why do you say that? I mean, I'm doing nothing but writing your story and your last words, she questioned. He smiled. Because you're no longer curious about New Haven, are you? I take it you found your answers like I did, right? He smirked. She looked up at him wide-eyed. He smiled and stood up. It's okay, Angela. I know too. I don't sleep much either. Find Arya if you can. If you ever need help, find Seth, he said as he walked towards the guards. Declan, she said, lifting her head to meet his eyes. I'm sorry, she said, fighting back a tear. He smiled, turned, and walked out the room. Several guards followed behind him. Then the last guard stopped and slightly looked back at Angela. He said quietly under his breath. She gasped and watched the last guard leave the room. She gathered her things as she silently contemplated what it all meant. Orchestrated, she thought. When she glanced behind the veil of the New Haven program, she saw things that she wished she hadn't, things that gave her nightmares. Declan had read and seen things in a chat he shouldn't have, that turned him into public enemy number one. She was sure an innocent man was going to die tomorrow because loose ends needed to be tied. She only imagined what they'd do to her if they knew she still had the recordings of that night at the New Haven facility. The mere thought of that upset her stomach and sent her stomach into a visible roil. She exited the visitor entrance and saw a large UGN BioNTech food delivery semi parked in front. She slowly walked toward her car, the heat vapor swelling up from the concrete. She watched a guy open the large back doors of the semi. She looked back for a quick moment, being reminded of that day. In that moment, her and the man's eyes met. Her heart briefly stopped. Her breath clogged in her chest, and her entire body froze. The hairs on her arms rose with an array of static charges from her head to her toes. John? She imperceptibly whimpered. She was unable to speak or breathe in that moment. The man's sea blue eyes widened. Angela? He said with shocked expression on his scruffy face. Tire. Fort Beam, Dugway Proving Ground, Salt Lake City, Utah. Deacon adjusted the surgical light on the thin, sedated girl strapped tightly to the hospital bed in front of him. Her breathing was stable, her skin slightly luminescent and pale under the white hospital gown. He spent the last hour running scans of her. He'd run a complete workup. He stood by her side and grabbed another blood sample from her arm. He then placed the sample carefully under the microscope. He watched something in her blood slowly move around. It looked familiar, but not. He had seen something like this before. He sat back in disbelief. He ran for his notebook and then pecked away at his computer. This can't be, he said under his breath. He ran to a nearby cooler where he retrieved a blood donation. He grabbed a syringe and retrieved the sample from it. He then introduced the sample to her infected blood under the microscope. He watched the virus go from slow motion movement to quickly attacking the new healthy cells in a matter of minutes. It attached to the cells quickly. It penetrated and transformed the cells and replicated itself. A healthy person didn't have a chance once infected. It was instant, but he was unsure of the effects of it. He'd spent an hour studying the scans. He'd seen scans of people who suffer from the Lacuna's virus. He'd seen the areas of the disease of the brain where it switched off the victim's self-preservation switch. But this did not switch off the self-preservation switch. It was the Lacuna's virus, but modified or mutated. The most deadly viruses learn to change out of preservation. No one liked the idea that viruses learn because it implied that they think. Most humans could not and did not want to fathom the possibility of a sentient virus. But Deacon had always believed there was a sort of awareness in all viruses, because if not, why mutate? The mutations were always stronger, more aggressive, more deliberate in its attempt to evade, capture, and eradicate its host. The Lacuna's virus had mutated, but to what? He stood up and got another syringe, took a sample of the woman's blood, and walked over to the mouse cage in the corner of the room. He lifted two small white mice and walked them over to a glass cage on the desk. You will give me answers, he said as he placed one of them gently inside, and the other he injected with the infected blood and placed it inside. He quickly fastened the lid and looked at both of them run around in the cage. If you are the original lacking this virus, you'll try your best to kill yourself. But if you are what I think you are, you will not, and instead try your best to infect your little friend. We'll see then how long you last, and what you become once you are both infected. I need to know what you are, he said, smiling at the two animals running around unaware. Show me your secret, he said to himself. End of part 10. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Everything you do to help support this channel is appreciated. Thank you.